When I saw it the first time, I'm like, whoa, wow. Hello everyone, I am History Professor Jared Frederick, and welcome to the next episode of Real History. And I think you're in for a real treat in this episode because we are going to be examining the much beloved and highly popular James Cameron 1997 film, Titanic. Yep, the biggest Hollywood movie of all in the eyes of many. This is a movie, when it originally debuted, a lot of people thought that it would be little more than a popcorn chick flick set in a historical ambience, if you will. But it ended up turning out to be much more than that. And we're going to be diving into some of the stories behind the making of this film, as well as some of the really rich historical context in which it takes place. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's check out Titanic. James Cameron, the director, he later noted that he had some difficulty first envisioning what the opening titles of his film would look like. And ultimately he came up with this last-minute solution. He thought, hey, you know, I'm going to take footage from the set and I'm going to make it look archival. And I think it really helps set the historical tone for the film. You know, right off the bat, you know it is something that takes place in the past. You know that it is something that is filmed in kind of the infancy of motion pictures. And, you know, oddly enough, even though we think of tragedy when we envision the Titanic, we see one of its happiest moments here in the beginning of the film with people waving. You know, it's one of the bright moments of the story. Yet it is set to this very sad and somber music by the master musician James Horner. And so it definitely helps set that tone, that very rich setting right from the outset. Right out of the gate here, there's some technical liberties that James Cameron himself admitted to, because we see two of these deep sea submersibles descending at the same time. And in reality, such craft, when two go down together, they have to launch about 30 minutes apart from one another. And so that's some artistic liberty here taken on the part of the filmmaker, but once again, it's to set the scene. And what we see here in some of these opening shots, and I'll add too, that a lot of these mock-up submersibles were filmed in fake smoke, and that actually is what makes it look like it's descending through water. But what we see here is some really brilliant editing, because in 1995, director James Cameron took some cameras to the Titanic wreck site, which is over 2 miles below the surface of the Atlantic, and he actually filmed a lot of footage of the wreck site. And so what you see in many of these shots is the genuine thing, and it's kind of a historical document in and of itself. It shows us what the Titanic looked like in the year 1995. And so there's a unique way to decipher which shots are real and which shots are recreated. In some of the shots where you only see one of the submersibles, that's the real thing. But in shots where you see two of them together, those are the ones recreated for film purposes. But just really stunning footage here. And, you know, and it's interlocked with certain shots that were recreated in a 20-foot deep underwater set in a studio. And so it's just brilliant editing here, and it's really quite seamless. And it certainly conveys, you know, this sense of foreboding and doom that awaits this luxurious liner later in the story. The vessel that we see here that is pulling the submersibles out of the water is a real-life oceanic exploration ship, which is a Russian vessel that is called the Keldysh, and it's a ship that has actually gone to explore the Titanic on a number of occasions. One of the operators of one of the subs here himself was one of the designers of said subs in real life. And so even in the context of 1990s exploration, this is a very authentic movie, which undoubtedly is what James Cameron was going for. But something else that we get a sense of here with these scenes of the crew and the salvage team interacting on the deck is that they are not kind of these pure-minded historians. Yeah, they may know their historical facts, but they aren't out to save or preserve history. They are out to make profit from it. And with the safe from Rose's stateroom being opened up here, Bill Paxton's character is not going through this stuff, through these artifacts in a very delicate manner. He's just kind of throwing it out and lobbing it onto the deck because that's not his main concern. His main priority is to retrieve the said heart of the ocean, this massive blue diamond, and to profit from it. And so suffice it to say, most people who have actually gone to the Titanic would treat artifacts with a little bit more tender, loving care. And, you know, Robert Ballard, the gentleman who helped discover the Titanic in 1986, this is one of the reasons why he is very much against artifacts being pulled from the wreck site, because in his mind, it's a mass burial site. It's these people's graves. He's of the mind that it should be left alone. And that's something that historians are really torn on. And I can certainly respect his perspective on leaving it alone, but at the same time, artifacts that can be recovered can tell incredible stories. And as Indiana Jones would say, it belongs in a museum. And I think as long as there's that caveat that it's in a museum and it's helping to educate people about this tragedy, I think that's a fair compromise.
It's okay, I'll feed you in a minute.
Now he has chartered Russian subs to reach the most famous shipwreck of all, the Titanic. He is with us live via satellite.
James Cameron was trying to figure out what a home of a 100-year-old artistic free spirit female looked like. And to help answer his question, he met up with a well-known sculptor, Beatrice Wood, who, you know, was in the final years of her life at this point, and it was her home and that sort of aesthetic look which became the inspiration for Rose's home here in the film. And another fun point to reference here is that the actress who plays Rose's granddaughter struck up a little bit of romance herself with James Cameron during the production of this film and ended up marrying him not long after.
Never done before. Your expedition is at the center of a storm of controversy over salvage.
Turn that up, dear.
The actress playing Old Rose in the film witnessed a lot of history in her own right. This was classic Hollywood actress Gloria Stewart, who was in her 80s at the time of filming Titanic, and they aged her up to look about 20 years older than what she actually was, and she was a little bit wary about that fact at the outset, because she hadn't been in movies for like 30 years, and this was her kind of grand re-entry into big style cinema. But in any case, Gloria Stewart was best known for her kind of glamour Hollywood roles in pre-code Hollywood. And so in the early and mid 1930s, there were a lot of really racy, what would be considered scandalous films in which she often played this femme fatale, a leading lady, if you will. And in a lot of ways, she is this very sort of daring, adventurous, free spirit young lady that the character of Rose herself was later on in the movie. And so it's no mistake on James Cameron's part that he chose this actress specifically to play Rose, because indeed Gloria Stewart would become the sort of woman that Rose herself would become later in the film.
Rose DeWitt Decatur died on the Titanic when she was 17, right?
That's right.
If she had lived, she'd be over 100 by now.
101 next month.
Okay, so she's a very old goddamn liar.
But one of the little details here that you got to enjoy about Bill Paxton is the earring that is on his ear, because it alludes to the fact that he's essentially a modern day pirate, and then he's wearing jewelry and he has kind of this tan blonde look like an old-timey pirate might. And so a very little creative touch there on the part of James Cameron.
Yes?
Are your staterooms all right?
Oh, yes. Very nice. Oh, have you met my granddaughter, Lizzie?
Something else that's interesting to mention in regard to kind of Bill Paxton's character exploring here is that it was just a few years later that he gave voice to a James Cameron documentary called Ghosts of the Abyss, where he and James Cameron go to the real wreck site and they kind of explore it together in one of these subs. And Cameron himself has gone to visit the wreck site dozens of times. And, you know, we could only wish that Hollywood directors would devote such attention and passion to their historical subject matter as James Cameron did to this film. Of course, he took artistic liberties, he fabricated parts of the storyline, but the passion really shows. And he kind of had this unbending attitude in regard to the authenticity of the film, which, of course, sometimes many directors just simply lack.
She hits the berg on the starboard side, right? She kind of bumps along, punching holes like Morse code, dit, along the side below the waterline.
This computer-generated graphic that Rose is shown here on the Keldysh is very helpful, because it not only reintroduces the story of Titanic to her, and of course, you know, she's watching the film like, yeah, buddy, I know what you're talking about, but it gives an overview to audience members. For people who may have been unfamiliar with the Titanic prior to this, the movie is spoiled right from the outset, but people have kind of the most basic historical context necessary to know what is coming. And rather than the movie getting bogged down in the technical details later on, it is presented to the audience immediately.
It's been 84 years, and I can still smell the fresh paint.
Some of these lines that older Rose says in this kind of impromptu interview session, it's like it's taken almost verbatim from the accounts of real-life survivors. There was a passenger in second class by the name of Ruth Blanchard, and I believe it was she who, you know, said, you know, for the rest of her life, you know, every time she smelled fresh paint in the remainder of her days, she thought about Titanic. Because, you know, the Titanic, you know, it may sound cliche, it had that new car smell to it. Passengers had never been in it before. It was fresh. These people were the first person to sleep in these beds, you know, in their quarters and in their staterooms and so on. And so it really added to the sense of adventure. And as Rose said, it was for this reason why people often called it the ship of dreams. But for many passengers similar to Rose, instead it would become the ship of nightmares. It's certainly a dazzling entrance on the part of Kate Winslet, and I'll just say from a material culture standpoint, this movie is pretty much second to none in regard to the research, the detail, the authenticity that went into the clothing. It's just spot on. It lines up perfectly with period photographs of the time period, and Rose just really sticks out with kind of that white dress that she's wearing. Everyone else is kind of wearing these drab and grayish-looking clothing, and right from the outset, we get the impression that this is a young lady who stands out in a crowd.
I don't see what all the fuss is about. It doesn't look any bigger than the Mauritania.
You could be blasé about some things, Rose, but not about Titanic.
And here we have Rose talking to her mean-spirited, smug fiancé, Cal. And she seems decidedly unimpressed with the scale, the size of the Titanic. There's talk of the Mauritania, there's talk of the Olympic, and the Olympic was the sister ship of the Titanic, essentially the same vessel in structure, size, and might. And the Olympic, which was launched in June of 1911, just a year prior to this, it got even more press. It got even more celebrity. But that certainly didn't infer that the Titanic didn't get a lot of celebrity as well. This was a big deal. The White Star Line was very gifted at promoting its brand. And among the number of pieces of literature that they released is something like this that was advertising both the Olympic and the Titanic, respectively launched in 1911 and 1912. And with a document like this, I love passing out stuff like this in the classroom, and I love giving students tangible items where they can examine them themselves. But this, really kind of got the point across, to show just the mammoth scale of these vessels, and they would say 45,000 tons, 882 feet long, can hold X number of passengers. This was the stuff that sold their product and encouraged people to buy ships, and it did so in a very effective manner.
Jack, you are Pat, so you bet everything we have.
When you got nothing to lose.
And of course, we're introduced to Jack Dawson here, a fictional character played by Leonardo DiCaprio in this kind of seedy bar, and he's amidst a poker game. And this too is a historical concession. There were no bars as such located in such proximity to the wharf where the Titanic took off from, but it certainly helps introduce us to the nature of his character. And as James Cameron later said, Jack Dawson was partially inspired by Call of the Wild author Jack London. And Cameron was really inspired by a lot of London's writings, his style, his sense of adventure, his bohemian lifestyle, kind of living off the seam of his pants and living on the fly and so on and so forth. And so even though Jack is a very fictional, very composite character, there are nonetheless strands of historical truth that can be found in his persona. And that's something that is certainly worth mentioning.
Passengers!
Have you been through the inspection queue?
Of course. Anyway, we don't have any license. We're Americans. Both of us.
It's very doubtful that Jack and his pal would have been able to get aboard with only 5 minutes notice after they faithfully won their tickets. But it's kind of an interesting, fun, and kind of revealing sort of interaction that we have here with one of the officers as they're going across the gangplank. And third-class passengers were inspected for lice, disease, things of that nature, because there was a fear of infestation on the ship. And certainly these were not concerns that first and second class passengers had to go through. But these third class passengers, we're going to be talking a lot about them throughout the film. They were, incredibly diverse. They were composites from every walk of life, from all over the world. And as far as the White Star Line was concerned, that was something that had to be taken into account, and you had to look at the cleanliness of people. But Jack here says, it's okay, we're Americans, we're all right. It certainly speaks to this kind of notion of perhaps some Anglo-American superiority that was certainly prevalent at this time. And even if we only get a whiff of it here in this scene, it's certainly there.
Nice to meet you. I'm Jack Dawson. Nice to meet you. How you doing? Who says you get top bunk, huh?
What is Sven?
One of the best lines, but also one of the simplest lines in the movie is, "Where's Sven?" Well, luckily for Sven, in losing those tickets, he, of course, wins his life as a result. Yeah, certainly some dark, if not comedic, irony to be found there. As the ship is leaving Southampton, it's important to note something that the film left out, and that is that the Titanic almost had a collision with another vessel that was called SS City of New York. And this was perhaps due to a number of factors. Captain Smith, for as experienced as he had never quite handled a ship as large as Titanic. Additionally, there was an ongoing coal strike that slowed down the kind of assembly line of coal, if you will. And as a result, the harbor, the wharf, the decks were incredibly jammed up with ships that day. And you gotta wonder, you can pose these hypotheticals. The ship probably would have been better off if it had struck that other ship and had been delayed by repairs, and then it would have missed the iceberg, and who knows what would have happened to it in the long run. But those are just mind games.
Oh God, not those finger paintings again. They certainly were a waste of money.
The difference between Cal's taste in art and mine is that I have some.
And in seeing these various paintings being brought into Cal's stateroom, we really kind of get a sense of the artistic trends of the time. There are Monets, there are Degas, and Cal kind of looks down upon it as this kind of subversive, degenerate art. But Rose sees something in it, and in that we get a sense of her free spirit that will grow and intensify as the film progresses. You really get a sense of the ship's scale in these boiler room scenes. And I believe a lot of these engine components were filmed in a live ship. And then, of course, they were a lot smaller, and then actors were superimposed amongst them to make these giant levers and cogs and rods look even larger than what they were. In this movie, it uses a clever mix of practical effects mixed with what was then cutting-edge CGI. And this was one of the reasons why the movie was so groundbreaking. They didn't need to rely solely upon models as many movies before it had. And, and even looking at the film over 2 decades later, a lot of these shots just hold up really well. They truly spared no expense in this regard.
21 knots, sir.
And here the audience members are introduced to Captain Edward Smith, who was a longtime veteran of the White Star Line. This was to be his last voyage, his crowning achievement as a captain, and instead he would go down in infamy. And it's fun to point out a little bit of Hollywood trivia here, that actor Bernard Hill plays him in this film, and you know, it's spot on casting in that regard. But Bernard Hill appears in 2 of the 3 movies to have won 11 Academy Awards, Titanic being one of them, and then just a few years later he plays King Theoden in Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, which also won 11 Academy Awards. And the first movie to have won 11 Academy Awards, was 1959's Ben-Hur, just in case you were curious.
I'm the king of the world!
And, you know, a lot of people think, you know, that the king of the world line is really hokey. But, you know, for a guy who's down on his luck, that hardly has any money in his pocket, who just won a ticket, you know, onto what was then the classiest vessel in the world, I mean, how could you not feel good in a moment like that? And, you know, with Dolphins here jumping in front of, you know, the vessel, you know, that was something that was not entirely uncommon. You know, it happens. And, you know, it just kind of speaks to this exuberance of the moment. You know, we think of the Titanic as a story of tragedy, but I think one of the brilliant aspects of this film is that we often see people having a good time on this ship. People are on vacation. Things are bright and sunny. People are optimistic. And certainly that's how they felt in the first days of the voyage before doom ultimately struck. Some of these overhead shots were some of the most expensive shots in the history of cinema. That one of looking at all the smokestacks as the ship sails by, that was like $1 million by itself.
Hey, who thought of the name Titanic? Was it you, Bruce?
Well, yes, actually. You know, I wanted to convey sheer size, and size means stability.
And here in the dining room, we're introduced to a number of characters. We have Bruce Ismay, who is the head of the White Star Line, who doesn't come off too well by the end of our story. We have the so-called unsinkable Molly Brown, a real-life woman who was born in Missouri, married into money through a mining company. She had separated from her husband 3 years prior to the sinking of the Titanic, when she became famous, and she was living well off of her former husband accordingly. And she explored the world, and she even traveled with some of her fellow Titanic passengers, who we'll talk about a little bit more later on.
Luxury, and above all, strength.
Do you know of Dr. Freud, Mr. Ismay? His ideas about the male preoccupation with size might be of particular interest to you.
And of course, Ismay, you know, he's kind of depicted as one of the subtle villains of the film, because he's a man possessed with the desire for speed, publicity, gaining recognition, beating the Olympics record, and this will have dreadful consequences.
The ship is not.
All of the sketchbook shots that we see here of Jack drawing people throughout the film, those are actually James Cameron's illustrations. Those are his hands drawing and kind of cutaway close-up shots. And so, you know, what a gifted artist, not only cinematically, but artistically in a visual sense, what he can do with a pencil as well. So, talented guy.
He's English, no?
Oh, it was built in Ireland. 15,000 Irishmen built this ship. Solid as a rock. Big Irish hands.
There were dogs on the Titanic, and one of the young passengers named Eva Hart remembers seeing French bulldogs being walked about on the deck of the Titanic, and accordingly we see one such French bulldog here depicted in the film. And James Cameron grew smitten with this dog in particular and ended up adopting him as a result of this interaction on the film. You know, and sadly, I suspect that these dogs did not survive, so they too were, I'm guessing, in many regards, victims of this tragedy.
Oh, forget it, Boyle. You just like have angels fly out of your arse as get next to the likes of her.
So the director stated that, you know, he doesn't really subscribe to this old Hollywood formula of, you know, boy meets girl in a casual sort of sense. And he says people are often drawn together through dramatic circumstances. So he wanted to cut through a lot of the crap, and, you know, and it's kind of indicative of where this story is going, where these, you know, kind of illicit lovers meet amidst a failed suicide attempt. And so, you know, but James Cameron always thought of this as Romeo and Juliet on the high seas. And in fact, that is how he pitched it to studio executives. He showed the higher-ups these wonderful paintings by artist Ken Marshall, who was also a visual and historical consultant on this movie. And he showed the executives these photos, and he says, I picture Romeo and Juliet on this ship. And that's one of the things that allowed him to get this project green-lighted. And so that sense of doom and forbidden love, although you may think it's somewhat a cornball in some circumstances, it certainly works in regard to pitching a project of this scale. Undoubtedly, a few years later, director Michael Bay tried to use this same formula with the movie Pearl Harbor, and it had more lackluster results that weren't quite as dazzling, I think many would say.
What's all this?
Yeah, this is not the sort of position that you want to be caught in here in the early 1900s, a third-class passenger hovering over a first-class passenger in this rather compromising position. And, you know, had something like that happened, you know, a character like Jack definitely would have been thrown in the brig. He definitely would have been thrown into shackles, just because that was the worldview. It's a good thing Rose was, in this case, a somewhat honest person in telling her story.
I was leaning far over to see the propellers, and I slipped.
But I love this sort of phony conversation, this explanation that she has with Cal and the men, because, you know, she's playing a dummy. And really, she's playing them for fools. She's not the fool. And in this male-dominated world, where women were divided by separate spheres, often considered to be the property of their husbands or spouses, significant others, it would have been easy for a woman like Rose to play dumb while talking about mechanical things, you know, and the character of Colonel Archibald Gracie here, you know, said, you know, women and mechanics never mix, you know, women and machinery never mix.
She wanted to see the propellers.
Like I said, women and machinery do not mix.
With the introduction of Colonel Bernard Gracie here, we are also introduced to the wonderful character actor of Bernard Fox. And, you know, Bernard Fox, he was in, you know, Hogan's Heroes and a lot of other really memorable classics from the 1950s, the 1960s, 1970s. A lot of people may not know this, but he's actually been in 2 Titanic movies. He was in this one, and he was also in the 1958 film A Night to Remember. In A Night to Remember, made 40 years prior to this one, he actually plays Frederick Fleet, the lookout up in the crow's nest. And so he plays 2 very different people in 2 very different iterations of the Titanic, but both of them are quite memorable in their own way. Colonel Gracie was an interesting character in and of himself, of course, too. He was a very wealthy entrepreneur who came from a very celebrated socialite circle. He had served in the military prior to becoming a multimillionaire. He ultimately did survive Titanic's sinking, and he wrote a very compelling memoir about his survival experiences. However, he passed away only 8 months after the sinking. Probably due to the long-term effects of hypothermia. And I have no doubt in my mind that there was probably a touch of PTSD that also afflicted him as well. But if you go to Google Books, you can find a free version of Colonel Gracie's book that can be read in its entirety. And quite a story it is.
Perhaps you could join us for dinner tomorrow evening to regale our group with your heroic tale.
And, you know, while we're on the topic of, you know, notions of women's right, female empowerment, of course, keep in mind, we're still 8 years away from women having the right to vote in the United States. This battle was being fought simultaneously in Great Britain and in America. But, you know, a comparison that I often make in the classroom, just about a year before the Titanic sank, we see another tragedy taking place in New York City where the Titanic was supposed to be destined to go, that takes place at the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire, where, you know, women who were making shirts, you know, they were working in this dangerous factory environment where the doors were locked, the machinery was faulty. There were no fire codes or safety regulations or anything like that, and you have 150 people die in this fire as a result. And even though the Titanic is a much more significant, in some ways dramatic event, these two events bear a lot of similarity. Not only do they take place in the same era, but in the end, those people who are most responsible for the deaths of innocent people are not held accountable. And you know, I think that is one of kind of the hidden themes of this movie is accountability, perhaps even arrogance to an extent. And certainly I think these are some big historical themes to reflect upon as we watch Titanic.
It's interesting. The young lady slipped so suddenly and you still had time to remove your jacket and your shoes.
But also here on this scene on the stern where Rose almost loses her life, we're introduced to another wonderful character actor in the form of David Warner, who plays the valet/bodyguard Lovejoy. And Lovejoy is this former Pinkerton detective. And the Pinkertons were well known for a long time of carrying out the law that paid them the most. And certainly that was the case with Lovejoy's character here in this film. But Warner, too, much like Fox, was in another Titanic movie, a Titanic television movie from 1979 called SOS Titanic, in which he played the journalist Lawrence Beasley. And so there are at least two actors in this movie who have been in two different Titanic movies. This too is something that was undoubtedly not lost upon James Cameron.
Look, I know what you must be thinking. Poor little rich girl. What does she know about misery?
And these scenes on the top deck where we see Jack and Rose further, growing intimate and getting to know each other. Had the ship not sunk, this is what the Titanic otherwise would have been known for. People walking on this luxuriant ship, having a good time, enjoying the sun. It's not just about the sinking, it's about everyday life on this ship. And we get a wonderful snapshot of that sort of lifestyle in these scenes.
Do you love him?
Pardon me?
Do you love him?
You're being very rude.
In the background, what we see here is actually the real ocean, because at this studio, that was located at Rosarito, Mexico. They built this set right against the beach, and the deck was at a high enough elevation that they were able to have a real ocean and a real sky in the background. And so here too, reality and recreation are often so seamlessly blended together that you can't even really tell which one is real and which one is fake. But you know, just the wind blowing, the ambience, the real sea in the background, it lends itself to the sort of realism that James Cameron was going for.
Son, do you have the slightest comprehension what you're doing?
Not really.
Well, you're about to go into the snake pit.
And to help passengers navigate this societal terrain of the ship, there was a handy guide like this. And within this booklet was a listing of the first class passengers and their families. And so long before social media, this was the means of social networking on the Titanic in 1912. And it's a fascinating little artifact that tells us a lot about the wealthiest of people who were aboard this ship.
I was right. You and my son are just about the same size.
Pretty close.
It may seem like too great a coincidence that Molly Brown would just happen to have a spare tuxedo in her stateroom. But in actuality, she had a son who was in his early 20s. And, you know, she was quite the shopper as she was traveling abroad. And it's not out of the realm of possibility that she would have had, you know, some fine tailored custom suit from Paris or somewhere to take back to the United States for him. So perhaps it's not so much a stretch after all. And here we are introduced to the grand staircase, which went multiple levels throughout the Titanic, and you know it's crowned by this massive glass dome. And although what we see here is slightly larger than what the original one was, otherwise it's just created to a T. We see the iconic clock in the background, and we also see this famous cherub who is holding a lamp here at the bottom of the staircase. And believe it or not, that cherub has since been recovered from the ocean floor, and it is on display at a maritime museum in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And so there are so many of those sorts of tangible traits in the film that have since resurfaced or have been cataloged or rediscovered in some way. And, you know, there, I think you can certainly speak to the value of something like that being behind glass for future generations to see and learn from.
And that's John Jacob Astor, the richest man on the ship. His little wifey there, Madeline, is my age and in a delicate condition.
And here we are introduced to the character of John Jacob Astor, who is played by Victor off The Young and the Restless, for many of you that may recognize him earlier in Rat Patrol, a World War II series earlier in his career. And but, you know, to go back to the story, Astor was the richest man aboard the Titanic. He was a real estate magnate. He was probably a few decades younger than he's depicted in the film, but he certainly had that air of sophistication and wealth that this actor was able to carry in his performance. And, you know, if Astor were alive today, he dies in the sinking of the ship, but, you know, if we were to equate his wealth to today's standards, he would be worth several billions of dollars. And it just goes to speak to the sort of clientele that the White Star Line was going after. That one of the richest men in the United States was a first-class passenger on the ship. And there were a number of other people who had near misses, a number of other wealthy individuals who almost purportedly had tickets on the Titanic, and among them was Milton Hershey, the famous confectioner who became wealthy in and of his own right around this same time. And I really love this kind of party scene in the third-class lounge. And I enjoy it for a number of reasons. We kind of get this lighthearted reprieve before the movie takes a really dark turn. And these sorts of things happened in this space. These passengers comprised a melting pot aboard this ship, and they were a microcosm of the growing American story. Many of these people were undoubtedly bound for Ellis Island. Many of them undoubtedly aspired to become American citizens. And these sort of kind of cross-cultural interactions where people of different nationalities would mesh together for a time, it really kind of forecasted their lifestyle that they were soon to embrace in the United States. And so, you have people from Poland, Russia, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Western Europe, all coming together here, and they're having a good time and getting to know each other, making the most of their kind of cramped confines down in steerage. And I can't help but imagine that this wasn't fun to film for all of these people. The musicians who are playing in the background, they're a real band called Gallic Storm. And they struck up quite a melody during these scenes.
You're not to see that boy again. Do you understand me? Rose, I forbid it.
Oh, stop it, Mother. You'll give yourself a nosebleed.
This is not a game.
This scene with Rose and her mother in the stateroom, not so subtle symbolism here of the mother tightening her corset, kind of like smothering her. Because, ultimately, what a huge part of this story is all about is that Rose does not want to bend to the will of her mother. She doesn't want to become a puppet to either her mother or her fiancé. And so, this is also a story about generational conflict. And these sorts of dynamics were certainly at play in the 1910s as more and more women were expressing these attitudes of liberation. They were demanding empowerment. They wanted suffrage. They wanted the right to vote. We see them breaking away from older generations, embracing new lifestyles. And all of those themes are in many ways perfectly encapsulated in this small clash, these mind games that play out between Rose and her mom, and also between Rose and Cal. It's very revealing stuff that is quite appropriate to consider for the historical time period. There were religious services held aboard the ship. There were 3 different ones, actually. There was one for first class, there was one for second class, and there was one for third class. And I believe a priest and a minister who gave the services for second class felt like being charitable, and they went down to third class to do services for the lowly sort, as they were often called at the time. For many of those people who were in attendance at those services, it would be their final opportunity for worship.
Okay, son, wind it up tight like I showed you. That's right. Okay, now let it go.
What's good? What's good?
Nice.
That's excellent.
Right after Jack hops the railing here to get back into first class, we see a a recreation of a famous Titanic photo of a buoy spinning atop. And as if that wasn't great enough as it is, there's kind of an Easter egg in this scene, because the man in the gray suit who we see in the middle is actually well-known Titanic historian and technical consultant for this movie, Don Lynch. Don Lynch wrote a fantastic illustrated history of the Titanic in the early 1990s, and a lot of the visuals in that book, as well as the stories described therein, were of massive help to James Cameron as he was stitching this film together. And additionally, Don Lynch, with artist Ken Marshall, in a special DVD edition of this film, they do a historical commentary track on the disc. And that's where I got a whole lot of good information and nuggets as such for this episode. So a nice tip of the hat to the historians whose scholarship and lifelong work made so many aspects of this story possible.
Jack, this is impossible. I can't see you.
I need to talk to you.
No, Jack, no.
In this brief little interlude where Jack pulls Rose into the gymnasium, we really get a sense of how the Titanic was so cutting edge for its time. I mean, today, when we go on ocean liners, we expect to find, you know, modern day conveniences, amenities, and forms of entertainment. But, you know, the Titanic, it had this gym, it had a swimming pool, it had a Turkish bath, it had a spa, it had all these kind of extracurriculars that had never before really been widely available on passenger ocean liners. And so, you know, even though we only get a few glimpses here and there of these sorts of amenities on the ship in this movie, it's just a really great little period detail that we see here.
Decided she wanted lavender. She knows I detest the color. So she did it all despite me.
If only you'd come to me sooner. Ruth saw some of my designs.
It's a great scene here where we see Rose looking over to the little girl who's being kind of molded and sculpted into the ideal kind of sophisticated housewife. And in seeing that little girl, Rose sees herself. And this is really what pushes her more and more to gravitate towards Jack and essentially renounce her lifestyle as a socialite. Now, in reality, you know, for as stunning and memorable as this scene of taking flight is, you know, chances are, you know, some officer up on the bridge probably would have yelled down at them, you know, to get down from there. You know, the White Star Line certainly did not want to get sued. They didn't want people falling overboard. But for dramatic emphasis and dramatic purpose, you know, it certainly works. These transitions back and forth between the flashbacks are just so brilliantly cut. And it shouldn't be any surprise to us that Rose is especially attached to this butterfly hairpin. And this too is kind of allegorical because during Titanic's sail, you know, she kind of comes out of her cocoon and blossoms into the person who she would ultimately become. And so a very nice little kind of artistic insert there on the part of the filmmakers.
Jack, I want you to draw me like one of your French girls. Wearing this.
All right.
Wearing only this.
And here we have it, folks, the most paused moment in the history of VHS tapes. on a filming note, this was one of the very first scenes that was shot, and I think it was done for two reasons. One, much of the rest of the sets were still being constructed, and two, James Cameron wanted to have an icebreaker between these two actors. Obviously, they spend a lot of time being intimate in this film, and there's no better way to break that ice than to, well, get right down to the nitty-gritty here right off the bat on the filming schedule. So I have no doubt that Leonardo DiCaprio's impression, his reaction here when Rose first disrobes, was probably quite genuine in real life.